our fourth session on religious records and archives, we have the Reverend Dr. Becket Soule, who studied at Davidson College, the Episcopal Divinity School, the University of Dallas, and Harvard University, and holds the professional certificate in genealogical research from Boston University. Becket has taught at the Catholic University of America, the Dominican House of Studies in Washington, D.C., the Pontification College Josephinum in Columbus, Ohio, and Oxford University. He is currently Emeritus Professor of Canon Law at St. Paul University in Ottawa, Ontario. He has been a visiting lecturer and fellow at other institutions of higher studies in the U.S., Great Britain, and the Ukraine. Becket has served as pastor of Anglican and Catholic parishes in Texas, New Hampshire, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and England. He is now pastor of St. Margaret of Scotland Catholic Church in Maggie Valley, North Carolina. So we are incredibly lucky and grateful to have him with us today. Please help me in welcoming Becket Soule to the Georgia Archives.
Thank you. Two things to start out, which are going to be of importance as I go through. The first is something that I've always tried. I have taught this for a number of years, both in law schools and in seminaries about record keeping. One of the things, whenever you're looking at a record, is to keep in the back of your mind what it is that this proves. A record typically is going to prove one thing. It's going to have a whole lot more information on it, but it only proves one thing. So if you've got a baptismal certificate or a baptismal record, that proves that this person was baptized on this date. It does not prove who their parents were. People may be mentioned there. Does not prove who the parents are, does not prove where or when they were born. It does not prove who the sponsors were. It only proves one thing. So that's the first thing. When we're talking about records, realize that records may have a lot of information, and it's really good information, but the thing that that record was generated to do is what it actually proves. So that's the first thing to realize. The second thing to realize when you're talking about this in the Catholic Church is that the Catholic Church has been keeping records for a very long time. And that a lot of what I am going to be going through is hit and miss, because a lot can happen in 500 years. And so the level at which you're looking is sometimes important. Sometimes records will survive at a higher level of the church hierarchy and not at a lower level. So that's the other thing to realize, is that sometimes it can be spotty, but the higher you go, then the more confidence you can have that the records have actually been retained. So let's see. So we'll go like. Let's try. We'll do that. So I'm going to be dealing with a couple of basic questions here. One is an introduction as to the different kinds of records that there are. Then what records are kept? Typically, what would you see if you came across the different kinds of records? The second, where are they kept? And finally, availability. How do you actually get access to these? So first, the introduction. The Catholic Church has been keeping records, particularly with regard to the reception of sacraments. things like baptism, First Holy Communion, confirmation, marriage. And even though it's not a sacrament, there frequently will be a death register in many parishes, anointing of the sick, things like this. And anything that would connect to a person's canonical or legal status. And it's been doing that since centuries. This has been more closely regulated since the time of the Council of Trent, which was a universal council of the Catholic Church that took place in the middle of the 16th century. So, what records are kept? What's there, and on your handout, you also have this. It's from the Code of Canon Law, which is the law which regulates the Catholic Church. Canon 535 talks about parish registers. So what is going to be recorded in the parish register? Baptisms, marriages, deaths, and a number of other things. Who is supposed to keep those? Typically the pastor of the parish. That the parish is supposed to have its own seal that you can use to certify documents. And there is to be an archive. In most cases, it's a safe or some sort of storage area in which these are protected. So looking at what has been mentioned here. So in the case of baptism, which is in the Catholic Church typically administered to infants, but also people who have not previously been baptized at any age can be baptized. Sometimes you will get people who have a certificate that has been given to them. Sometimes it was given to them when, or to their parents, it was given at the time that they were initially baptized. Other times they ask for it for some other purpose. That is going to be taken from the entry in the register, so that that's going to be the source. The register entry would be made at the time of the baptism, typically, or not long afterwards. The certificate can then be made at almost any time. The source and the information that's there typically is going to be recorded. There are adoption issues, so that, and this is, you'll see more about this in the handout, so that the Catholic Church in, I think it's 1997, changed its rules with regard to the recording of adoption. So for example, if someone is baptized and then is adopted, in the baptismal register, you would have the birth parents listed. And so if the adoption occurs after the baptismal register is not changed. However, the adoptive parents are added to that. And that's part of what is, there's more detail that you can see in that in the handout. But probably the most useful part of all of this are the annotations, and I'll show some examples of baptismal registers in a couple of minutes. The annotations is a column on the right-hand side of the register. Almost all registers look exactly the same. And in those annotations, things like a subsequent marriage, if someone got ordained, for example, if there were other things that affect a person's legal or canonical status, that would be added in the annotations. Sometimes it's just interesting information that they put there. Because in a sense, the baptismal register is what they used to call in school your permanent record. And so anytime anything happens to you, whether in that parish or in another parish someplace else, news is going to be sent to where the baptismal register is kept, and things will be put as annotations. And again, I'll show you some examples in a couple of minutes. With regard to marriage, there is another register for marriage. Sometimes that will be for the initial marriage. Two people have exchanged consent and have gotten married. In the United States, Catholic priests in most jurisdictions are able to use the religious ceremony in order to effect a civil marriage as well. There are some exceptions to that. However, the state does not always recognize marriages between two Catholics. Likewise, the Catholic Church does not always recognize a marriage which has taken place in a civil form. So that there is something which is called a convalidation. So if someone has married civilly, two Catholics have married civilly, but there has been something that, something missing from the Catholic understanding of marriage, they can then exchange consent before the church, and the church will then from that point on consider that they are married. However, that is called a convalidation, and sometimes that does not happen until, well, several years after the original marriage ceremony. But that's what a convalidation is. It is a new exchange of consent for two people who are then considered married in the Catholic Church, because whatever was the problem initially has been taken care of. There is also something known as a sanation. This is what I always refer to as the magic wand canon. And that is, according to all of the Catholic Church's laws, these two people are not married, but poof, you're married. And not only are you married, you are retroactively married. And this is, I'm not going to get into this because it's way too complicated, but this will also be, sometimes you will see that word in the annotations, and that's what that means. That's a retroactive validation of an initially invalid marriage. Whenever two people get married, no matter where they get married, the original church in which they were baptized will be notified, and it will be put in there. So even though these people were married someplace else, even though they were baptized in this place and left when they were 6 months old, it's still there. All of the things that affect a person's status, and being married is something that would affect your status, is in there. Any dispensations, so if there was an impediment, examples of impediments are to use, for an example, age. The minimum age for women is 14. Minimum age for men is 16. However, there is the possibility of being dispensed and getting married at an earlier age. What's called consanguinity, blood relationship. You can be dispensed in order, let's say, to marry your first cousin. I did not grow up Catholic, but I always use as the example in class. My father is the only person in his family who didn't marry his first cousin, because it's legal in North Carolina as long as there isn't insanity on both sides. But if there were permissions that were necessary, that would also be recorded in the marriage register, and that can be important. And then the source and the information are also recorded. So, for example, here is And one of the things that you will notice immediately is the language in which this is recorded. So most registers up until fairly recently, by which I'm going to say the 1980s, were in Latin. And there's good news and bad news there. So the bad news is that the Latin is probably not the kind of Latin that you would have studied in school. And the good news, however, is that only a limited number of things are being recorded. And so, as with many legal documents, it's the same words over and over and over and over again. So once you get it, then it's all taken care of. So this is a baptismal register. You see across the top the heading, Registrum Baptismorum, and then ego infrascriptus, I the undersigned, baptizavi, I baptized in the top one there. It says Marianum, so that would be Marian, and then not because she's a woman, and Latin words have gender. And then I would just simply translate it from the Latin, on the 24th day of the month of November, 1903 AD. And then it gives the names of the two parents, Jean Misiaco, and then the address. And this is Jersey City, New Jersey. Joanne, and that's John. And then Anna, which is the wife, Kwiatek, and then who the sponsors were, the Petrini. Now, so that is the baptism. You'll note two things. One on the far right, listed in English. So Marian there, Misiaco, married Walter Kwiatkowski on January 31st, 1959 at St. Anastasia's Parish in Teaneck, New Jersey. And then it gave the Reverend J. Quigley was the officiant at that. So even though they were not married in that parish, that affected the person's status. And so that was added there later on. Unusually, on the left-hand side, it says Joseph J. And it's somewhat obscured. First husband of Mary Masiaco died on the 11th of October, 1946. So you can tell from this that she was, even though the first marriage was not listed there, you can tell that she was married twice. And you know who they were, and you know that the first marriage ended by death. Under the second one, both of these were baptized on the 6th of December. Joseph Fatam, and that's Josephine. That would be Josephine in English. The daughter of Francis Laskowski, and Agata Kiselewska. Not surprisingly, this is a primarily Polish parish, which is another thing that helps having all of this in Latin, because you don't have to try and figure out what the Polish word is. And then in the column for annotations on the right-hand side, matrimonio conjuncta, so joined in marriage to Francisco Martini, Frank Martini, on the 14th of October, 1939, in the Church of St. Anne's. And so this shows both what is in the original baptismal record, as well as the kind of things that get put in the annotations. Here, this is a full page. You can see in the lower right-hand corner there, this is also a baptismal register, but it has married, in the lower right-hand corner, married Walter Jones, May 21st, 1931, Jersey City. And then it has in Latin, coram ministerio. That means before a Protestant minister. So that it is not a marriage that would be recognized by the Catholic Church, but this is, this obviously affects the person's status, so that they are, that they are, they do have a spouse. This is a marriage register. You can see a couple of things here, so that in the top one, and I've blown it up there, it has the name of the person married to, and the name that they, the name of their spouse, declared null by the Newark Chancery, and then it gives the date. The 6th of April, 1953. This is a marriage which took place and then received a declaration of nullity. So that would be listed there. In the bottom one, you see two dispensations. The first one, dispensation from the three bands. According to canon law, the marriage had to be announced 3 times on 3 successive weekends. It was the equivalent of kind of getting an ecclesiastical marriage license. Sometimes, however, where there's not enough time, that could be dispensed, and if there were other ways of proving that the person was free to marry. The second one, dispensation disparitatis cultus, disparity of cult. This means that the person is marrying someone who is not baptized. So that can happen, but that is that's a dispensation. You may recognize this name. This is from the Register of St. Aidan's Catholic Church in Brookline, Massachusetts. The name Johann M. Fitzgerald Kennedy. So that's John F. Kennedy's baptismal register. And you will see under the annotations, elected President of the United States. You don't see this very frequently in Catholic baptismal registers. The date of the election, and then assassinated in Dallas, Texas, November 22nd, 1963, requiescat in pace. But you see the same sort of thing, so that there is also the notice of the marriage. Jacqueline Bouvier. It took place in Newport, Rhode Island. Again, a variety of things get put in annotations, but typically the thing that you will find is if there is a subsequent marriage. You have some other things here. This is also from the St. Aidan's register there. Sometimes if there is if there's a dispensation, if there is a later convalidation or sanation of the marriage, this also will be put there in the register. In the case of a death, I mean, that's obviously not a sacrament, but the source of the information is going to be, sometimes it's the funeral home, sometimes it is a survivor, The information to be recorded there, sometimes the cause of death will be listed, typically the place where the person is buried. And that may not be in the parish itself, so that can be useful. Up until, I'm going to say, about the 1960s, cremation was frowned upon. It's still not encouraged, but cremation may not be noted. Before about 1960, it would be. It really is not anymore, but there is no notification to the Church of baptism. So you've got someone who was baptized. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're still alive, particularly if it's recent. There are other records that are kept. For example, First Communion, the first time someone has been admitted to the sacrament of the Holy Communion. Sometimes there are separate registers for that, sometimes not. Confirmation. The diocese will have, because where confirmation has been given by a bishop, the diocese will probably have its own register. Sometimes the parish does, sometimes the parish doesn't. There are also some modern registers, what's called RCIA, the Rite of Christian Initiation of Adults. So if somebody becomes a Catholic, not being baptized as an infant, but becomes a Catholic later on in life, there may be a separate register for that. Sometimes it's just put in the baptismal register. Now, there are different levels for all of these. So on one, and different records are kept at different levels. So in the case of a parish, you've got sacramental records. Sometimes there are language issues. I showed you the one from St. Anthony's in Jersey City, New Jersey. You've got Latin, you've got English, you've got Polish. Because sometimes the priest who is recording all of this doesn't speak English. And so that's why using Latin is probably the safest thing. Sometimes parishes, particularly those that have been in existence for hundreds of years, are closed. Sometimes they are merged. Sometimes they're divided. And there is what's referred to as the Kennedy Directory, and that's Kennedy with one N, K-E-N-E-D-Y. That's the official Catholic directory. It lists all parishes in the United States, geographically divided according to diocese. And the Kennedy Directory has a list of where the records from closed parishes are kept. And that's really useful. In the case of chaplaincies, sometimes in the case of, let's say, academic chaplaincies, college chaplaincies, or something like that, sometimes they have their own registers. Most of the time, they don't. And so this would all be registered at whatever the local parish is, the local regular parish church. In the case of military families, the Archdiocese of Military Services, which is headquartered in Washington, D.C., there is a computerized listing for all Catholics. For example, Catholics who were serving overseas and were baptized or married at a military base. That is all recorded in Washington, D.C., and it's all computerized, and you can just kind of call them up and get an answer. You may not be able to get a certificate, but you could at least get an answer and information within a matter of seconds. On the next level up, so parishes are geographically grouped in what are called dioceses, and on the diocesan level, you find various judicial records. For example, declarations of nullity. If someone was ordained, that would be records that are kept on the diocesan level, in addition to where this person actually served. So what parishes was he at? in the case of religious orders or religious congregations or societies of apostolic life, these would be kept by that organization. So I, for example, am a Dominican friar, a member of the Order of Preachers, and so they've got a bunch of files on me. And a lot of times, record keeping has been centralized over time. And so in some cases, the diocese will ask for registers to be transferred to them. They will then microfilm them or now digitize them, and then they'll send them back so that if something happens, if there was a fire or something in the parish, the diocese may actually have a copy of it because they have asked for this on a previous time period. And then finally, going to headquarters, the Roman Curia, the earliest records that are in Rome with regard to people are from the 15th century. The Apostolic Penitentiary. So when you wanted to get a dispensation in order to marry or something like that, you would request that from the Apostolic Penitentiary. Now that is a person and not a place. The Apostolic Penitentiary is the person who granted favors, typically legal favors, from the Middle Ages on. Now, there are limitations with regard to access of documents in the Roman Curia, but they are open to research and scholars after about 100 years. There are some exceptions to that, as you might anticipate. I have some things mentioned in the handout. So, for example, documents with regard to the Second World War, and particularly refugees in the Second World War, those have been opened up actually fairly recently for that. So the Holy See, so the Vatican Archives, has functioned in several different capacities. It has a really complicated organization. I did work for the Vatican. I was a minor Vatican bureaucrat for a few years in the Congregation for the Eastern Churches. And the bulk of the archives in the Vatican pertain to the period from the 16th century to the present. And there is at the University of Michigan, of all places, what's called the Vatican Archives Project, which is identifying what documents there are in the Vatican and who holds them and what they contain. Some important archives are what is called the Propaganda, the Congregation de Propaganda Fide, now known as the Congregation for the Evangelization of Peoples. This was responsible for all mission work around the world. So even where there was no formal church organization in a particular area, South Pacific Islands and things like that, they would still have records of what was going on there. There are a number of tribunals. The Roman Rota, which began in the 14th century, and that is the standard appeals court in the Catholic Church. The Signatura, which is the highest court, and the kind of court of last resort, kind of like the Supreme Court for the Catholic Church, and the Apostolic Penitentiary that I've already mentioned. They all have their archives, and they have cases, lots of cases. And it's not necessarily all kings and queens. A lot of times, ordinary people bringing cases before that. Now, most of the modern congregations, or what's known as the Holy Office, which was the Roman Inquisition, there is no access to those archives. So if all of a sudden you find something went to the Inquisition, yeah, you're out of luck on that one. But this is one of my absolute favorite books. the Vatican Archives, an inventory and guide to historical documents of the Holy See. It's organized according to agencies and groups, and it has 500 entries that describe the purpose and the working of each agency of the Vatican and all of the official records that it produces. And those are the records that now constitute their archives. That is an absolutely spectacular research tool. And so finally, accessibility here. Having taught law and canon law for 40 years, I can say this, and it is absolutely true. Sacramental records are public in that legally they will stand as valid, authentic evidence when an appropriate civil record does not exist. So, for example, if you are trying to get a passport and don't have a birth certificate for one reason or another, but you do have a baptismal certificate which gives your date and place of birth, that'll work, depending upon who you're talking to. But they are public records with regard to the church and frequently recognized by the state as well. However, in a number of cases, and depending upon who you talk to, a lot of pastors say that sacramental records are private, and that and you can understand why they would say that, because they're created in circumstances in which they are presumed to be personal and confidential. And so that some of them are confidential, and I mentioned, for example, adoption information, which is put in the sacramental register. Now, there's also a decentralization in all of this. So the sacramental registers are not open to examination by anyone except authorized church and parish personnel. That does not mean that you can't get that information, but it means that unless you are the person who is involved, they are probably not going to hand over an official certificate to you. They may allow you to look at the register under supervision. They may allow you to make notes and to copy things out of them. Some of those registers, as you noticed, are on Family Search. And so they were obviously microfilmed at some point or other. Looking at the dates, probably sometime in the 1920s or so. As far as more recent things, then privacy is going to be an issue. And then the only way that I can really talk about this is under luck. Anyone may obtain an authenticated certificate of his or her own sacramental record, and with proper identification, the certificates of direct relatives or legal dependents. Some dioceses, if you send them, and they have this online, some dioceses, if you send them a request, I know that somebody that I'm looking for, that I'm researching, genealogical research, someone was baptized in this diocese in or around the year X. And, you know, you put this request online and then they'll come back and they say, well, we can't find anything, or this is where it is and this is what the information is. Others, I have had a number of, let's be nice and say, what the diplomats refer to as a full and frank exchange of views with the Archdiocese of Hartford in Connecticut. And they say, no, it's absolutely private. It is sealed, nothing ever. And I said, really, but this canon says that I can see that and this. No, 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 absolutely not. If you go next door to the Diocese of Bridgeport, Connecticut, oh yeah, sure. I mean, here, look at the registers. Yeah, go into the other room and we'll take pictures of it for you. So some of it is luck. And not to make a fine point of it, a lot of times people will come and ask me, and because I am a former Vatican official, because I am also teaching law, and I know most of these people, and I taught most of them. In some cases, I was the one who organized the sacramental register policy for that diocese. And so I just say, please, not going in and kind of making any demands. Please, can you just kind of look at this register and tell me what you can find? As I said, in a lot of cases, you may even find them on Family Search. And NEHGS, the New England Historic and Genealogical Society, has now put online all of the registers from the Archdiocese of Boston, which is where you can see the John F. Kennedy one. So that previous parish, or the previous picture, that is my church. So that's St. Margaret's in Maggie Valley at 3,500 feet and never lost power. But we didn't have internet for a while, and so it was nice and quiet. And that's one of our parishioners. So there are my emails if you have other questions that may pop up after today, or if you need assistance in finding records, I'm always happy to help. But I guess we can have some questions or anything if there are. Yeah.
Yes, I was curious, who has access to the records regarding the Inquisition if they're closed? I mean, does certain church officials have access?
The people who work for, let's see, what is now called, keeps changing its name, the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith. They publish some of their records if there is a significant historical connection. So that, for example, the records of that with regard to the papal bull Apostolicae Curiae, which was on the declaration that Anglican orders were absolutely null and utterly void in 1897. Those not only were opened, but were published and edited so that so not only do you have all of the documents, but you have like lots of footnotes identifying everybody who is mentioned in them. But that the whole thing with Galileo, that's all been published. But if you were less famous than Galileo Galilei, then that's still there. So that they are. I was once, a friend of mine worked there when I was working in Rome, and once kind of walked me through. And you've got huge bound volumes, manuscript volumes back to the 15th century, and it's there may be at some point opening it up to special scholars or something like that. And parts of it are for historical eras of historical interest are published, but there are miles and miles of these things. And so it's, I mean, it's not always, it's not always clear when these things are open and when these things are not, but typically one of the things with that is because that congregation, because that dicastery is still functioning, it's a lot easier just simply to keep everything confidential. So that I worked for the Congregation for the Eastern Churches, which deals with all of the Eastern Catholic churches that are in communion with Rome. I was responsible for the Ruthenian Church in the United States and Canada, the church in Ethiopia and Eritrea, and the Malankar Church in India, all three of which speak English. And that was the one thing that they really were worried about in the congregation, because what kind of deal do you make with yourself that you can understand this language? They would, whenever they got correspondence in English, they would come, they'd drop it on my desk and they would step back because they were sure it was going to explode. I mean, how can you possibly understand English? And but those archives, which go back to the 19th century, are all closed and probably will remain closed, simply because on a need-to-know basis, basically, because each one of those things affects a continuing Catholic Church entity. So again, where there's enough time has passed, and it may very well be published, but for the kind of things that you would be using mostly for genealogical research, I'm going to say both of those would be of limited usefulness. Yeah.
Presentation was very interesting and gave me some food for thought. I have a friend who is from Mexico, and she was left in an orphanage at a young age and was adopted by a family in Wisconsin. She's recently gotten her DNA done, and we're trying to go through tracing some of her roots. The question I had, or what piqued my interest, was the fact that you talked about the baptismal records being in Latin and at the parish level.
Mm-hmm.
So if we know where her the orphanage was, Montgomery Morlands, would there be baptismal records at that level that may have her parents' names on it, and how do you access something like that?
Well, you probably have done enough genealogy to realize the answer to that question is always, it depends. And it depends when the child was baptized. It also depends on when the child was adopted. So if the child was adopted, let's say at a very early age, the child may have been baptized after the adoption, in which case the adopted parents would be there in the baptismal register. The orphanage records, the orphanage may have records. One thing though, if you've got DNA and you start getting links and you start to kind of, build, what Blaine Bettinger always calls a quick and dirty tree, and you put that all together, and then you may see a geographical area where most of these people are from, or a couple of families keep showing up on a regular basis. You can then get in touch with the Catholic Church in that area and see what these names are. Kind of that will help you. And again, Family Search has some of these, particularly if you're starting to go earlier. So if you start getting, let's say, parents or grandparents, and you can then look on Family Search for Mexican baptismal records. And because most of these records, most of these registers have indexes. So, you wind up finding, all of the Morales family, and there they all are, and you've got all of this. And then you can kind of keep going through there until you start seeing a cluster of names that keep showing up, so that that can sometimes be helpful. But if the baptism happened, after the adoption, that baptismal record will not, it may say adopted, but there will be no record of the birth parents. All right, in the back.
Wait,
Sorry, but
what connection help African American genealogy or slave genealogy?
well, there was, I'll start out with what I think is one of the most interesting of these. So, and it's also the connection with Mayflower stuff. I am the governor of the North Carolina Mayflower Society, and spend lots of my time on research in colonial New England. Squanto, who was the person who basically is responsible for the survival of the Pilgrims after that first winter, showing them how to plant and harvest. Squanto spoke English because he had been kidnapped in a raid on the coast of Massachusetts, and was brought to Spain, where he was freed by a number of Franciscan friars in Spain who baptized him. He then went to England, which is where he learned English, and then eventually came back to what became New England. So I am really amused that the Pilgrims were saved by a Catholic. Now, there was in, not necessarily the South, but there were segregated churches up until about the 1950s. And so there were the churches for, I'm using the language at the time, for the colored work, as they were called. And so they have their registers, and they, a lot of times, will have information that is no place else. So for example, baptism and parents' names, because these would be exactly the same as kept in any other kind of register. These parishes, by and large, were merged with the local, the other local Catholic parishes, the white parishes, starting in the 1950s and 1960s, so that there are no longer segregated parishes in the Catholic Church anywhere, but that these black parishes would have registers, and those may very well have information in them that is not present in any other, certainly not in any legal or civil records. Now, where those records, the fact that they kept records is important, and the fact that those records were preserved. And that's, again, looking at something like the Kennedy Directory. It's no longer going to say, segregated parish or black parish or anything like that. But if you've got some sort of, these were flourishing parishes in a number of areas. I'm thinking like up in Raleigh. There were 5. And this is up until 19. I'm going to say they were all integration. All of the parishes are integrated. And I think that was 1959 in Raleigh. But they were all they all had records, and so that is and particularly if you start going into the 19th century, those records would be could very well have information that is not anywhere else. So that is again, the terminology that gets used is something that I think nowadays would probably be considered offensive, but this is a resource. And I think it's a very important resource because of things that were being recorded there that may not have been recorded anywhere else. Oh, yeah, sorry.
You mentioned this individual pilgrims.
Squanto, yeah.
Spell
S. Well, this is Squanto. There were the two Native Americans so the pilgrims landed, came to Plymouth in December of 1620. They did not see another human being that was not on that ship for 4 months. Half of them died that first winter. They knew people were out there. They knew, but Plymouth had been devastated by a plague before they got there, and so when they got there, they found bleached bones on the ground. That probably is not the kind of housewarming present that you're really looking for. And on the 25th of March, 1621, having seen no other living human beings since they came to the New World. So they came in November, and then Samoset came in buck naked, carrying an arrow with no tip on it, showing he came in peace, stood in the middle of the pilgrim village and said, "Welcome, Englishmen," in English. That got their attention. And the next day he brought Squanto because he had some English that he had learned from fishermen in Newfoundland. But Squanto had actually lived. And so Squanto came, and Squanto could speak English. And then he introduced them to Massasoit, who was the chief of the Pokanoket. And they, within a couple of days, they had the treaty with those. So that's another. Samoset, from what we can tell, never was to England, but Squanto, who was the one they dealt with mostly, had lived in England and could definitely speak English. All right, so if I'll be around for a few more minutes and everything. You've got my emails. If you've got any other questions, I'm more than happy to answer them.